fantastic piece of gear, the 1962 Fisher 800B. Probably, in my opinion, was maybe the single most greatest stereo receiver of the golden era that Fisher Radio Corporation produced. And I'm real lucky with this unit to have the 1962 Fisher catalog in pristine condition, and you saw a couple pages of that, but it cannot begin to give you the story of what an amazing person we have here in the founder of the Fisher Radio Corporation, and that is Avery Robert Fisher. And it's quite a life story because it's a person whose name will fade into history only to be remembered by audio aficionados. But it is a man who had so many different talents that producing such a great thing as this Fisher 800B unit with a $400, even if you can find it, the walnut cabinet here, the real Fisher audio case, if you can find them for $500. This is, as it sits, a $1,500, $1,600 unit today. It is a thing of beauty and super highly collectible. But I've done stories before, background stories, and they've been very popular on YouTube. I did a thing on a video on what makes Marantz great, and really keyed down on the life of Saul Marantz, who started the Marantz Radio Company with his mother in Kew Gardens, New York City. And it's interesting that we have somebody that comes along, a contemporary in the same time period, who did the same thing in the same exact city. But let's start with the life of Robert Avery Fisher. We can fast forward to the time when he made a donation to the Lincoln Center, which was built out of basically derelict and slum property because of Robert Moses, the architect of a grand plan for New York's redevelopment. Love him, a lot of people hate him. But the Lincoln Center was born, and Avery Fisher donated some millions of dollars to have his name attached to that. And his fame at that time was at its peak. Well, he's gone now. I believe he passed away in the 80s. But let's talk about the life of this extraordinary man and why his desperation led him to found the Fisher Radio Corporation. First he founded the Philharmonic Radio Corporation, then went on to found in 1945 the Fisher Radio Corporation. Avery Fisher was the son of an immigrant. He was one of 6 children that whose father and mothers immigrated from Kiev in what we know as the independent country of Ukraine today. It's a family of Jewish heritage, and when they settled in the United States, it was not uncommon for families of Jewish heritage to insist that their children learn how to play a musical instrument. And it was very interesting the way that Avery Fisher's father decided who would play what instrument. Line the kids up: number 1, piano; number 2, violin; number 3, piano; number 4, violin; number 5, piano; number 6, violin. Well, Avery Fisher happened to be number 6 in that family, and he became quite a proficient violinist, and he really loved the pursuit of music. And much like Saul Marantz, he would be disappointed at the listening of records and recordings compared to what he would hear in concert halls, and it drove him towards perfection. But his life did not start out to be a charmed one. When he graduated from NYU, New York University, in 1929 with a degree in engineering jobs, he was just coming into the Great Depression at that point, and jobs were pretty scarce. But he did happen to latch on to a company, the Meade Dodd Company, After he was his company, he worked designing brochures. He worked for an advertising agency that did work for banks. When that agency folded up during the Great Depression, Avery Fisher went to the company that did the engraving and the printing of the brochures and offered his services out of desperation in 1933 after being unemployed for about 6 months. Well, the company offered him, said, sure, we'll take you on, but we can only pay you $18 a week. Can you imagine that? $18 a week. Well, the Depression was biting real hard in 1933, and banks were failing left and right. The New Deal was coming in, and Fisher was glad to have the job, but the problem was he latched on to a real, as he called it, a real bad boss. Problem was, it was one of those bosses, the owner's son situation. He was only a year older than Avery Fisher, but Avery Fisher stuck with him that he was never treated with respect on that job. For example, there was a time when Avery Fisher noticed that the department that did the engraving for plates and things like that was purchasing their materials using a separate purchasing department, apart from the paper and book printing division. And one day Avery Fisher had the idea, why don't we combine these two purchasing departments? We'll increase our purchasing power and get a better deal, and we can heighten our efficiency by, well, losing some staff. Well, the boss had thought that that was a great idea, and it was so well received, and Avery Fisher said, I think this can save $10,000 a year. And the boss said, that's great. So what would you do in that situation if you're making $18 a week? You would hit up the boss for a raise. But what does the boss say to you? Sorry, Avery, that's not going to happen. You know, I've got guys from Yale University, young graduates, pounding the pavement, looking for a job like this. I could just as easily get one of them as you. Well, we can call that a turning point in Avery Fisher's life. Oh, I do love that unit. It's amazing how many great inventors and how many promoters and pioneers of the arts and sciences and engineering and other pursuits found their stride because of some adverse event that happened in their life. Working for this boss for about, I would say the better part of 4 years, really burned Avery Fisher in his mind. He was barely making enough money to survive. And every day that he took himself into work was a chore, because he knew being in the owner's son's control meant that he really had no hope of advancement or recognition of the skills that he brought to bear in that business. So good for Avery Fisher. On the side, he started developing a passion for putting audio pieces together. Up until the time that Fisher started experimenting and doing things with radio, units were sold as consoles, where you had the speakers, you had the tuner, you had the amplifiers, all built into one console unit. It was the standard. But according to Fisher's thinking, when you bring components together like that under one piece of housing, you're probably going to shortchange the quality of some of those components. The speakers may not be engineered to the best that they could be. The tuner might not be as sensitive. Well, it's just good enough, put it in there. And the amplifier might not be clean, and no, it's good enough, put it in there. Well, Fisher was the first one in the history of audio that decided to separate components so that you could have separate speakers that were engineered to precision. You could have a tuner that was the best that money could buy, and you would have an amplifier that just was as clean as it was theoretically capable of being. The other thing that Fisher soon realized is that there was a market for these type of high-end components. He was kind of surprised. Remember, this is 1937, 38, 39, and there's people that are actually coming forward as a result of, he started a small corporation called the Philharmonic Radio Company, and Consumer Union tested some of the popular units at the time, some of the popular radios at the time, and they put the Philharmonic, the very first Philharmonic Fisher radio in there. It was called Philharmonic at that time, and Consumer Union raved about it. But in today's dollars, that was almost a $5,000 unit. Well, Fisher soon realized that there was a segment of the market that did not care about the price that they had to pay. They simply wanted the best listening experience that they could get. This was before TV. This was before visual media took over. It was all about the ears. And there were people that wanted, just like you would have home theater systems and IMAX movies today, you had people that wanted the absolute, concert hall listening experience, and they had the money to buy. Well, before Fisher knew it, he had a pretty good business going in the late 1930s, and one day he was finally able to walk into the boss's office and say, take this job, and you know what, with it, I have my own company now, and the Philharmonic Radio Corporation took off. Unfortunately or fortunately for Fisher, World War II was soon to come about, and the United States government took a very dim view of producing consumer goods during wartime. Consequently, Fisher sought government contracts and ended up making radios and communication devices for the armed service. Later on in the early to mid, maybe 1940s, he was able to land the first contract to put a landing system, I guess a radio-based landing system, into what we call today as LaGuardia Airport. But there was a big problem. He was in way over his head with government contractors, with generals. The constant scramble for capital to keep production going, the lags in being paid, it just proved to be too much. And he ended up selling the company. And in 1945, he decided to go solely in the direction after the war of having super high and high fidelity units that he wanted to produce and sell. Now, what is high fidelity? It means as close to a concert hall experience as you can get. Low distortion, wide frequencies, the highs, the lows, as faithfully as you could reproduce what you heard on the concert stage, he wanted in his units. Well, that was quite a bill, and he was pretty smart. He started hiring engineers from Europe, particularly Germany. There were a flood of them coming over. And he always had a passion, as I'll tell you later, for things foreign. But the real key to him was having an excellent engineering staff. And he started to produce units for the Fisher Radio Company. The first being, I believe it was called the T400 or T500. There's still a few out there today, circa mid-1940s. His real genius was having the guts to define his market. He only said to his people that work for him, look, you make the best product, the market will be there. It may be bigger at times, it may be smaller, but there'll always be that segment in the market that buys the best. He told people to consider that they worked for the Rolls-Royce of audio companies, and it was probably very true. He was passion-driven at every point. And as the production grew and the quality maintained, and as you saw on the page of this 1962 Fisher catalog, the list of first of Fisher on the back page up until 1962, and there were many more that followed after that. were almost legendary in the business. First company to produce a record player that would flip the record over and play the other side, the Fisher Lincoln system. He was also the first person in the early to mid 60s that offered the first fully transistorized stereo receiver, the Tune-O-Matic, on the market. Remember, a lot of people were very hesitant to go over to transistors because they had cut their teeth on vacuum tube radios, and it wasn't as easy a sell as you think it would be. But his pioneering unit, the first all transistorized AM/FM receiver, really broke the ice, and just from then on it was just a flood of transistorized product in the market. Very high dependability, reliability. Very few components ever had to be replaced. Okay, very, very great success. And the company grew from a small, modest little factory floor at 33 Bleecker Street in New York City to eventually having a really nice factories and offices in Long Island City, in New York, and also in Pennsylvania. He really rode the wave of the golden era of what we call high fidelity and stereophonic sound. He truly was producing the Rolls Royces of units that you see here. Not everybody would be able to afford them, but he didn't care about that. He cared about serving the people that just wanted the best. But there's so much more to the Avery Fisher story. And it's some of it's things that I find much more interesting than the engineering and production of high fidelity stereo units. Remember what I said about other pursuits that Avery Fisher had? Well, one of the things that Avery Fisher took pride in was his pioneering efforts in recognizing the quality and styling of foreign automobiles. In the 1950s and 60s, foreign automobiles were a real rarity in the United States. But Fisher prided himself on the fact that he always owned foreign automobiles, and he was always interested in performance and things like aftermarket products, particularly for Volkswagen, specialized exhaust systems, and just for all range of foreign cars, Aston Martins, etc. Well, he developed a aftermarket parts company. It was called the A.R. Fisher Products, and it was quite successful on its own. It seemed like whatever this guy touched turned to gold. Now, I have to stop here and say that as a boss, he was exactly diametrically 180 degrees different than the person he had worked with for at Meade Dodd. That person was stingy and a glory hound that did not care to share any credit at all. But you got to remember, at that time, Avery Fisher was recognized as a very skilled book designer, book cover designer, and the book covers arguably one of the most important features of selling a book. And although he never got credit for it, his book, one of his books, a couple of his books were in the top 50 of the 1930s, some of the most best-selling books, but he never got credit for them. And you know that probably rankled him in his mind. Well, he never forgot his passion. If you were to ask him, he would tell you that his number one interest was being a book cover designer, an artist for putting a book cover together. It is so important, and he was highly skilled at that. How skilled was he? Well, when Winston Churchill went to pen his tremendous series, 4-book series, I don't know what the heck it was called, The History of English-Speaking Peoples, and it was quite a smash hit. Not just in the UK, but around the world. Well, guess who designed the cover for that? Avery Fisher in the 60s was brought out and asked to design that cover for that series. Wow. I mean, is there anything that this guy could not do? And he did a couple other book designs too, and he donated all of that money to charity. I have to say that I think he was a pretty happy family man. I think he was happy in his accomplishments, and he was also very philanthropic. When the Lincoln Center needed to do a massive renovation in the 90s, Avery Fisher's name was already attached to, well, the Avery Fisher Music Hall at Lincoln Center. Well, the owners needed a lot of money to do the renovations, so they figured, why don't we try to sell the naming rights for the renovated building? Well, you know, I guess you could have been kind of taking that as an insult or whatever, but when the Fisher family was approached to the daughter and some other people, they decided to take, some millions of dollars as compensation for that. And I think they raised in total $500 million. I guess David Geffen, the music producer, contributed the bulk of that. But that's the kind of gracious lineage that Avery Fisher came from and produced. His name will likely fade, but when you think of the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts and you think of the Avery Fisher Music Hall and the operas and the Firestone theaters and all the famous broadcasts that came out of there, when he was talking about donating money to put his name on it, he was very involved in the process of making sure the acoustics worked great. Well, Fisher eventually sold out, I'm not sure it was in the 80s or 90s, to Emerson Corporation for about $32 million at that time, which is equivalent to about $280 million today. By this time, he was really and truly a billionaire. He had so many interests in so many different ventures and things. What happened was that Emerson pretty quickly turned around and sold Fisher to Sanyo, where it sits today. But right here represents the golden age of the Fisher radio company, and it's probably my most treasured piece in my collection. I think so highly of Fisher that I have four different units from 1962 to about 1964. They are just fantastic and they're highly collectible. But I'll tell you what, when it comes to a great human being, a philanthropist, a person that was a pleasure to work with, and a person that always pursued excellence in whatever he did, I have to tell you, Avery Fisher, in my mind, is the greatest audio pioneer in the history of the world, particularly as a person who produced the Rolls-Royce of vintage amplifiers and stereo receivers that are still so highly collectible today that there's often bidding wars for them. Stylish, beautiful, it's an Avery Fisher. Well, I hope you enjoyed this this little discussion of the magnificent life of Avery Fisher, the person I most admire in the field that I consider my hobby, vintage audio. And I'd love to get these little behind the scene things, because there's so much more to a person than just the thing that they produce. There's a whole life. There's a person like Avery Fisher that has varied interests and passions in life that he pursues, and much to his credit, virtually all of them, he made a resounding success and still managed to be quite a decent human being. Person I admire very much. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you appreciated this. And if you want to check out, I have another one. you can just put Marantz, Sol Marantz, S-O-L Marantz into the search box, and you can see my video about what makes Marantz so great. Now you know what makes Fisher so great. Thanks again, everybody, and don't forget to hit that thumbs up.